Hello and welcome everyone to the session featuring our speakers on effective screening, hiring, and training to ensure club safety. Today we're joined by Meredith Bonnell and Sarah Farr. Meredith made me mess up her name because she said it wasn't fancy, and now I have it in my head that it's fancy. My name's Lori Huggins-McGarry. I'm the director for the Pacific region with the Child Safety and Quality Assurance team with Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and on behalf of BGCA, we are so very happy that you're all able to join us. So before we dig in, there are a few housekeeping rules and tips I'd like to share. As you saw as you entered in, this session is being recorded and will be available on demand by the end of the day in the virtual attendee hub. If you're experiencing any connectivity or lagging issues, please try disconnecting from the VPN and reconnecting. Everyone will be muted throughout the session. Please use the chat feature to interact and engage with one another, and video sharing is not required at this time. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome and introduce our two speakers from the Redwoods group. First, we have, I'm gonna go out of order. First, we have Sarah Farr, who has been working with youth serving organizations for over a decade. Sarah has managed the Boys and Girls Club Safety Hotline while working for Presidium, and in her role as a senior consultant at the Redwoods Group, works with clubs all across the country to make them safer. Prior to working in risk management, she was shelter supervisor and case manager for youth and foster care. Sarah is considered an expert in child abuse prevention, and she's passionate about keeping kids and staff safe. And then I'd also like to introduce Meredith Bonnell, who is the Director of Consulting for the Redwoods Group, managing the team of consultants working nationwide to reduce risk and enhance safety in youth and community serving organizations. Prior to joining Redwoods, Meredith practiced law, specializing in domestic violence and child abuse protection before serving as a court-appointed counsel representing youth and families in the juvenile justice and foster care systems. Meredith joined Redwoods in 2017 and also serves as an adjunct faculty at Duke University, where she teaches a seminar on child advocacy for the graduate school. So I'm so excited for today's session. Thank you, both Sarah and Meredith. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Lori, and hi, everybody. I know we can't see you, but hopefully you can see us, but we'd love to kind of know who's here. So excuse me, if you can, go ahead and throw in the chat who you are and what club you're joining us from. We'd love to just sort of get a sense of who's joining us today, and really appreciate your time and attention as we get this time with you. Really want to thank Lori and the other BGCA hosts and tech hosts who are all involved with making this such a success. We're really excited that we always get really excited for an opportunity to talk with a group of clubs. And so Sarah and I are definitely excited to be here today. Just quickly, like Lori said, my name's Meredith. It is completely my fault if she was stumbling over my name. It's because I specifically told her that people sometimes stumble over my name. But I'm Meredith Bonnell. I'm the Director of Consulting with Redwoods. And like Lori was saying, my career has really been around making sure that kids and families have the support they need. And what I love most about working at Redwoods is that we have an opportunity to work with organizations like yours who are making sure that the communities that you sit in and the kids that you serve have a great shot at having all of the resources and support that they could need, so that hopefully they don't have to end up in some of the systems that I used to work in when I was working in juvenile justice and with the foster care system. So really appreciate having this time with you today. Sarah, you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, thanks so much, Meredith. And thanks again, everybody, for taking time out of your morning, midday, depending on if you're on the East Coast or Central Time. We're really excited to speak to you today. And I'm so happy to be able to work club adjacent. I've never worked in clubs, but always worked adjacent and next to y'all in the work that you do. So just excited to talk about today's topic. So I think the first question is, who is Redwoods? We are a socially responsible and mission-oriented insurance carrier. And so a lot of times I tell people I kind of work at a nonprofit that happens to do insurance. So we are unique in that each one of our accounts has a dedicated consultant that works with them. And we work with each one of our accounts on a preventative basis. And so no day ever looks the same for our consultants. Sometimes that looks like getting calls from CEOs, board members, or even YDPs. And we're a preferred carrier of Boys and Girls Clubs of America. We meet all of those safety standards that were passed, and we work all across the country, as has been mentioned a little bit before. We're in big and small, urban and rural, and we also serve clubs that serve Native communities as well.
Thanks, Sarah, and apologize. I'm going to keep going on and off mute. So I hope I'll be quick with my mute button today. It was one of those moments that we all love in a virtual world where lawn care across the street suddenly started about 4 minutes before I logged on to do this session today. So I'll try to make sure you don't have to listen to that the whole afternoon. So here's what we're going to cover today. So we are obviously talking about HR, but as it relates to, and really as it is, risk management. We know there's a lot of staffing conversations going on right now, and we want to make sure that we will be speaking from a place where we really understand that staffing can be a challenge right now. But honestly, that's part of what makes HR even more important as part of your risk management consideration. So we'll talk about what that means, and we'll talk about that sort of through the lens of that staffing life cycle. You've got prospective employees, people you're considering bringing into your clubs as YDPs. You've got new employees that you've got to get onboarded and introduced to your culture. And then once they're there, what do? Ongoing performance management is really an important part of how we think about risk and safety and keeping our club members and our employees safe. And so we'll talk about those pieces as well. Then we wouldn't be an insurance company if we didn't talk with you a little bit about what can happen when the worst happens. And so we will talk a bit about how HR matters and plays into things when unfortunately we do see claims activity and some of the things that we've learned from some of the more recent claims that we've seen. And then we'll talk a little bit about when we see best practices, what are some of those keys to success and how do we make sure that you're really setting your organization up for success in this area. Our goal is absolutely to leave time for questions. So we'll do some periodic time checks to make sure we can do that. But let's go ahead and jump in. So one thing we'd love for you guys to think about, and if you're up for it, please use the chat. But when I say HR as risk management, what does that idea mean to you? What does that look in your club space? Would love to get a sense of sort of where you all are starting from in this topic or why this feels important to you. So if you've got a chance and can go ahead and throw something in the chat, what does this idea mean to you?
Don't be shy. We work with enough clubs to know that y'all are a topic bunch. Even if we don't know all the names on the screen, being 8 steps ahead of a potential risk. If you can figure out how to do that, could you let us know? I'm like 2 steps maybe.
I'm seeing background checks, making sure people are trained properly, knowing, communicating, and enforcing standards. Sydney has seen our outline. Screening employees and onboarding. It's my job to make sure we're hiring safe, qualified people so we can have a safe and fun club environment. Intervening, strong onboarding process. Yep.
I mean, Meredith, I think we're good here. Should we just wrap it up?
Yeah. So Sarah, love for you to talk about kind of when we think about it, what are some of the things that occur to us when we are thinking about running our operations or what it is that we're looking for? What are some of the things that you think about?
Yeah, so when we work with a club, we look at it holistically. So we are thinking about operations and board management and employee safety and even HR practices. And for lots of reasons that all of you listed below, HR practices, when we have solid HR practices, that's when we can feel confident about how our clubs are operating, right? We talk a lot about how we want to get to a place where you don't have to think about safety and you don't have to think about insurance, that it's so much ingrained in part of your culture that you can really focus on building those next great leaders and operating the programs that you are, because that is so a part of your training and a part of how you are. And then the other thing that we really know about the organizations that we work with is that our society has changed drastically, even in the past, we know in the past 2 years, but even in the years preceding that. And that what that looks like is claimants and juries, and when incidents and bad things happen, even when you've done everything that you've thought you've done, we've seen that our organizations are being held to a different standard than they have been in the past. So when something bad happens, it opens up our organizations. And a lot of you can think about examples of where this has happened, hopefully not in your organization, but in other organizations. So let's talk about what are some of the ways that we can make sure that those bad things don't happen in our organization.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so we're going to talk about, like I said, sort of those 3 staffing cycles, right? The sort of 3 parts of the life cycle. So we've got our prospective employees, we've got new employees who we're going to onboard, and then we've got ongoing performance management. And as we're thinking about those things, I think something that's critical is that when we think about how we are managing our HR practices at each of those stages, it really speaks to your broader risk management plan. Because when you think about your solid practices at each of these stages, those are going to directly impact the safety of your members and the safety of your staff, which are both equally important. If we can't keep our employees safe, right? If they're not operating in a way that's safe, then we're not keeping them in rotation and we're not able to make sure we can deliver on our mission. So let's talk first about those prospective employees. So as we think about kind of where we are with this, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, because one of the things we want to make sure we're also acknowledging is what we're usually talking about right now when we're talking about prospective employees.
Yeah, so let's address the elephant in the room, staffing shortages. We have heard from every type of organization that we work with, every size, whether it is a camp in the middle of nowhere to a very large urban youth serving organization. They are all facing staffing shortages. And so even yesterday on a webinar, we heard a CEO say, sometimes I'm not always hiring a choice, I'm hiring the choice. And unfortunately, that CEO even said, that is not my first choice, but right now I need these people to run ratio and to be into programming. And so what we want to focus on today is this really important recruitment stage. This is your first opportunity to lay down your expectations. It's the first opportunity to follow the policies that you have written down. And it's your first time to really explain to these people before they come into your culture of safety what those expectations are. And so when you think about hiring, you want to think about the programs that you want to run and can run safely. It's not always what you've always done with the staff that you've had on hand. And I know a lot of us had to think really creatively when the pandemic hit, what that looked like. And for a lot of our Boys and Girls Clubs, you had to staff up. And so I heard from a lot of my clubs, well, I had to have a floater and I had to reduce my ratios because of X, Y, and Z. Maybe it was a state or local mandate or what your board decided to go with. But that's the first thing that we want you to think about when you're hiring. Think about the programs that you can run safely and then hire to those.
And so we wouldn't be having an HR conversation if we didn't get into a little bit of the nitty gritty as well. Because I think one of the things that helps us support those bigger picture ideas about our mission and how we're moving forward safely is making sure that underneath all that, we've got some really, really good practices. So let's jump into some of those details. So Sarah, job descriptions, they're kind of an annoying part of hiring new staff. They're kind of an annoying part of our HR practice, but why are they so important?
So this is what helps us level set our expectations. It lets employees know their responsibilities. It lets managers know how to hold those employees accountable. And so you have something that you can easily go back to. And so what we're advocating with our job descriptions is that they're consistent. And every employee should have a job description that's up to date at all times. And this is hard, especially in an ever-changing environment. So a lot of times you've probably had a job description for your school year staff and a job description for your summer staff. And maybe you had a job description for your COVID times. But this is something that we really want you all to think about and take a look at, especially as your recruitment pool gets smaller and smaller. We want them to be specific. So this goes back to accountability. We think about SMART goals. Are they measurable? Are they attainable? We think about the safety component. This should be a core of your risk management piece, no matter the role, no matter the title. Everybody is responsible for safety. from the top on down. And so how is that reflected in each one of your job descriptions? And yes, even physical requirements. And so this is something, a trend that we're really starting to see more, even in our club space, that we haven't outlined in our job description, the physical requirements of the job. And so think about what that means. Is there a chance that your staff will be on a ladder? Is there a chance that they'll be pushing something? Is there a chance that they're going to be lifting more? I know a lot of our clubs don't necessarily have a dedicated preventative maintenance person on staff. And so think about what is realistic that you are asking your staff to do, and definitely think about what you can outsource.
That's a great point, Sarah. And I think one of the things that we all acknowledge about job descriptions is that we need to leave a little bit of room for them to be ever changing, but we also really want to be proactive in thinking about what should really be contained there. So one of the things that we think about is giving yourself that leeway of sometimes there needs to be, oh, we've got a great question about this in the chat. What about other duties as assigned, right? Applying to staff. What you need to be careful with the other duties as assigned is making sure that it's not so far outside the realm that it goes against any of the other things you put in their description. So here's an example. We sometimes run into a scenario where we might need our club staff to be in a pool, but we've never laid that out as one of the physical requirements of the job. Can you swim? Are you comfortable in water? And then we suddenly end up in a scenario where maybe we don't have the behavior management we need on our field trip to the pool because we don't have staff that could be in water with our kids. So with all other duties as assigned, you need to make sure that that still stays within the other basic guidelines you've set out. So if what you said in your job description as a physical requirement is needs to be able to stand for long periods of time, needs to be able to lift at least 25 pounds, whatever that might be, some of those other duties can't totally negate that. Now, there may be other duties, like sometimes it's required that we're going to do things like, I don't know, referee basketball during gym time in the afternoon. If sometimes what we need that to be is we also need somebody to be the ref on the soccer field later that afternoon, that probably still falls under all the other duties as assigned. It's not totally outside the realm of possibility. But that's why it's important that you're also consistently updating your job descriptions, because as you see that the needs change, COVID was a time where this was really prevalent, you may need to update your job description. Maybe with COVID, they were handling chemicals and cleaning supplies in a new way. Maybe they had to use PPE in a new way. So this is one of those things that it's hard to stay on top of, but we know that it's important. So also before we've hired process, we've got interviews. Sarah, let's talk a little bit about interviews. How can we make sure that we're using these to the best of our ability to create a safe environment?
Yeah, so this again is really sometimes your first face-to-face or maybe Zoom to Zoom, sometimes on the phone. I know a lot of our folks have moved from phone to Zoom because now a lot of us have that capability. And so this is again, where you really want to reiterate what your safety commitments are, what your culture of safety looks like. And consistency here is twofold. So with every prospective employee, no matter the position, you should have an interview. That process should be consistent among roles. And so a lot of times I'll go back and do a file review for an organization. They'll say, well, we know them. They just submitted their resume. And so then I'll say, well, what does their interview look like? And they'll say, but we know them, right? And so we want that to be consistent across the board. And we want it to reflect the role. So is there scenario-based questions that you're asking? Are there open-ended questions that can reinforce the responsibilities, but also serve as a checkpoint? Can this candidate perform the role? One of my favorite questions to ask in an interview process is, tell me a time when a child really got on your nerves. And if they ever say, oh, that never happens, well, they're lying to you, because anybody that's worked with children or spent any amount of time around children, especially if there's going to be a lot of children in one space, they've gotten on their nerves, right? And so what you're looking for is, does this person have transparency? Are they willing to tell me the truth? And tell me how they've been reflective on how they can de-escalate themselves and recognize when there's a situation that I'm not comfortable with, right? And your interview should reflect the job description. So like we talked about the specifics in a job description, we want to ask about those specifics. So the example that Meredith used of, can you swim or can you get in water? That can't necessarily be a screening question unless you're hiring for a lifeguard. But if you do know that you want your staff to be in the water, we want to be able to make sure we can hire the right amount of staff that can be in the water. And then document, document, document. And then plus think about how long you want to store those documents. And by how long you want to store, what I really mean is what are your state requirements on document retention?
And you heard Lori say that I have a bit of a legal background. And so this is the part where I say documentation is so important. We're going to talk about this sort of throughout the conversation today, but beyond making sure that you're hiring the right person, documentation and storage of records is really important, because when you think about your EPLI coverage, right, your employment practices liability insurance, there can be claims not just for not just for someone who believes they may have been discriminated against while they were working at your organization or denied a promotion. We've also seen claims that come from someone believing they should have been hired for a role and that for some reason they weren't for some improper reason. And so making sure that you really document how you're maintaining, how you're making sure that this is the right person for your job. Here's the interview we conducted. Here are the background checks we did. Here are all the other ways in which we made sure we were really sure whether or not this was the right candidate. Documenting how you make those decisions is critically important and can be a defense against that kind of allegation. I almost just said, and I would have been spoiling the next slide, but I almost just said reference checks and documenting how you're doing reference checks. So let's talk specifically about those for a minute. Sarah, give us the lowdown. Why are reference checks so important, and what's important to keep in mind beyond just getting them completed?
Yeah, so similar to our interview questions, we want those to be open-ended too. We want you to ask things like, is there any reason this person shouldn't be allowed around children? And it's a hard question to ask, especially the first few times. And sometimes you'll get answers like, no, I don't think they're right yet. And it's not necessarily because they think they're going to hurt a child, but a lot of times we've heard things like, they're just not mature enough, or, I've never seen them around a child before, so I don't want to speak to that. And that's good information for you to have. We also recommend, we and several other organizations recommend family and kinship references. And what we mean by that is literally a family member. So maybe a parent or a guardian, or maybe they have a friend. And the reason why we recommend this is because these types of people are not often used as references. And so, 99 times out of 100, you're going to get, they're a perfect angel, or they've never done anything wrong. But we have had instances where the family member or the friend has told us a story, right? And they're giving us this elaborate story about how person got from point A to point B and they accomplished the task. But sometimes I've heard references that have told me about how they've broken the law to get from point A to point B, or they've done some unethical things and what they think they're doing is telling you a really good story about their friend or their daughter or their child. We've also had instances where family members have known that if this person is around kids, they might have a problem. And so a lot of times our family members are the ones that are most affected by that. And we recommend at least 3. Sometimes that means casting a wide net. And what we're looking for here is all knowable information. And so we know if you go to a past employer, they might just be able to say, these are the dates that person worked. Are they eligible for rehire? And if that's all the information that they're willing to provide to you, that is fine. That is the knowable information that you could receive from that previous employer. And then the big thing here, similar to what Meredith said, is document. If you didn't document it, it wouldn't happen. I have literally watched somebody on stand say, oh, I know exactly what this reference said, and this is what I was wearing that day, and they could even remember what they had for lunch. But it didn't matter because it wasn't documented. And so there's lots of different electronic systems that you can do this on. You could do it on a Google Doc. You could do it on old-fashioned paper and scan that in as well. But we are recommending the same policies that you document your applications, your interviews, that also needs to be mirrored in your reference checks.
And one thing I would tack on here is that this is a place where we do see people cut corners. And we especially see people cut corners when they know that applicant, right? When it's a former club member, when it's somebody who is maybe applying for a role with this organization when they've worked for you, but not for a few years. And what we find is, like Sarah said before, there's this fallback on we know them. We have to make sure we're rigorous and following our policies and procedures for every applicant to make sure that like we kind of talked about at the beginning, that when we go to bed at night, we feel confident that we are consistently following our practices, because when we don't, that's when we run into those gaps, and that's where we see those corners cut. This is an easy one because it feels like, well, we know they worked there before and here's how we know their family, but this is one where it's really important to make sure that we're moving through our whole process. All right.
So now you've brought them on board, and now is a really important time to reinforce everything that you did in the prospecting part before they officially became on board, and to reinforce that culture of safety that we talked about. And so, yes, they're going to get a lot of training from bgca.net. I'm sure they're going to get some shadowing, if at all possible, once they come into your organization. But let's talk about what onboarding looks like. What do you think, Meredith?
Yeah. Okay, so onboarding is so important to plan in advance, and we're going to talk about that a lot in this first bullet. So obviously it has to be job specific, right? We need to make sure that even if we're going to do some batch hiring, right? Maybe we're doing seasonal hiring for the summer, we're doing seasonal hiring at the end of summer for after school. We want to make sure that there really is job specific onboarding unique to their role, and that it needs to be set in place before the employee starts. Now, don't get me wrong, this is another one of those things that has been challenging, particularly recently. Things have been changing on a dime, right? We actually had put into place a hiring process that started in February of 2020. I can imagine, you can already tell where I'm going with this. We made some job offers. We had people with start dates all set to go. And those start dates were in late March and early April of 2020. So their job completely changed between the time they interviewed and got hired and then needed to get onboarded. And so we had to develop a brand new onboarding process to say, hey, that job is now completely different. And so we wanted to make sure we still knew we had a plan in place to get them up to speed and where we needed them to be without just kind of pulling it together last minute. We want to make sure that our onboarding process isn't just choose your own adventure, isn't just shadowing another employee, because like we all know, no day in the club is the same. What's going on with that employee that day might mean they learn really, really well how to manage this kind of thing, but not what's going to go on a day where we have to run a field trip, on a day where we've got a service project happening at our club, whatever it is that may be going on. And this goes back to really helping us with consistency and accountability. How can you be confident they've gotten all the training that you as an organizational leader need and want them to have, and the right touch points to make sure that it's not just getting put together as they go. So making sure we plan in advance, again, is a critical piece of making sure we've got that consistency and accountability. I know you're shocked that I can already hear you saying, and you'll want to write that down. But then we have to think about the core risk management component. And Sarah brought this up because it is a part of your, even kind of your prospective employee process, right? We want to make sure every employee that's working for you, every single professional in your club knows what they are responsible for, and that they are responsible for safety, their own and that of your club members. And so as you're thinking about that, you need to be thinking about how are we making sure they know the reporting structure, right? If they see a problem, or if they overhear something, or if there is an incident that happens between club members, do they know where to report that to? Do they know what your zero tolerance policies are, right? Do they know if there are specific behaviors that have to get reported up immediately, what those are? And then when we consider all of those policies, do we have our policies in writing? And have we made sure that as we're busy in our onboarding process, that we're updating those policies so that they're learning the most up-to-date thing? So when we think about it, what we need to be thinking about with our policies is, number one, are they up to date? Number two, are they really what we're doing, right? And COVID's been another time where we see that there's been a lot of drift away. Well, we usually do it this way, and this is what's written down, and that's what they signed when they were onboarded. But we really do it this way now because we had to change our practices and protocols because of what was going on with COVID. That means that there is some legwork required on our part to make sure that we're updating those policies to make sure that everyone is getting onboarded to what's really happening today in our club spaces. And so we want to make sure that we're getting signatures as well. You probably have some kind of code of conduct. You have an abuse prevention policy. We want to make sure that where there are those key parts of our policies and procedures that we need to know, number one, has the employee learned it, read it, know where to find it, and have we verified that? We need to make sure that we're getting signatures. So often that's going to be in your employee handbook. Some of you may have some of that stuff online, but you want to make sure, again, that we're capturing those things for every single employee that comes through your doors. Because like I said, every employee is going to be responsible for those key pieces of what's going on and what it looks like in practice when we've got our policies in place. And we need to remember too, because the next thing we're going to go on to is ongoing performance management. Onboarding is a really important time to train our staff, to make sure we're all speaking the same language, to make sure that we know what the general expectations are. But we all know that onboarding is a rush of information, and there's a lot that we get told, and you think to yourself, I know I learned that at some point that first week that I started, but I'll tell you what, I don't know how to do it 3 weeks from now. We need to make sure that onboarding isn't the only time we're doing training. So while it's important to make sure we introduce a lot of the core parts, particularly of our safety procedures, it's also okay to remember that onboarding is only part of the training process. And so we know we're going to have them drinking through a fire hose with all that information. It's okay to remember too that we're also going to have refresher trainings along the way. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. I'm sorry, I apologize, Sarah, I'm having trouble with these slides. But so as we think about ongoing performance management, we have to think about, okay, we've got these folks working for us. They know what to do. We've really had great conversations about our culture, and we think they really understand it. But we know from looking at incidents and just from talking to club professionals like you, that we frequently hear things like, I swear I taught my staff that, but they're just not getting it. And I'll tell you guys, that's something we heard a lot this summer, particularly as we're still dealing with COVID. We're still dealing with COVID procedures. We've got staff who are getting burned out. We're having staffing shortages, so we're often asking more of them. A lot of times we know that we were hearing from leadership, I just felt like I couldn't get my staff to get it. I was just really having trouble getting through to them. And that's the place where ongoing performance management becomes so important in making sure that our staff are where they need to be. Sarah, you want to talk a little bit about this part?
Yeah. So this is something I'm really passionate about, oddly enough. First off is performance review. So this should be ongoing and not just once a year. These are, yes, corrective conversations in the moment. There are goals over time, but there shouldn't be surprises, right? When we get to the point, if we're gonna have to part ways with the staff, barring a few exceptions. And you want to be looking for trends, right? So if you are an organization that has multiple sites and you're starting to see, I'm having a lot of the same performance issues with the same site, do we need to retrain a unit director? Do we need to look at what's going on at that site in particular? And so looking for trends in that area is also really helpful. And this is a two-way conversation with your staff. You want to work together to identify successes so they get buy-in into the same process. So for the employee and the club as an organization. And like I mentioned, these are informal, and in the moment. So you want to catch people doing something good and praise them publicly. Correcting those things right away also helps avoid habits when we catch somebody doing something that's not so great. And we also want to think about other ways to utilize the resources that we have. So some of our clubs have cameras. Is there a way that you can spot check those cameras to A, catch somebody doing something good, or B, catch somebody doing something that maybe needs a little bit of redirecting? And it's important that if we're catching somebody who needs to be redirected, that we've documented both the good and the corrective behavior, right? Because Meredith could look at the cameras on a Tuesday afternoon and see Sarah is on her phone again. And I've verbally told her to not be on her phone, but now I've seen her on her phone. So I'm gonna have a formal write-up. And then 2 days later, Hugh also sees Sarah on her phone on the camera, but maybe Hugh and Meredith didn't talk to each other about it, or maybe they haven't looked at the documentation. So that's why documenting it over time. And so we'll be able to see, we've got an issue here. Sarah has been on her phone way too much. There should be never a reason that she's on her phone.
Definitely. And I think this is an important part to talk about this idea of proactive and reactive training, because that's the perfect example of the kind of thing that could happen where you might have a time to do some reactive training. Proactive training is going to be, hey, we know we need our staff to know this, right? We're going to do it during onboarding. Here's what's going on with our mission. Here are the things you need to know about how we serve our kids. Here's how we manage our day and manage our time. Here's how we make sure we've got our bathroom policy in place, right? But that reactive training is kind of what I was mentioning before. It's where we see those gaps, where we see those slips. And particularly because we're often employing young people in clubs, we also just know that sometimes we need to remind some people of things, right? Maybe it's that no, you really can't have your phone out. Hey, we're really not connecting on social media, right? So thinking about what are those reactive training moments? It may come because you start to put a new program into place and you want to jump ahead of what you've seen when you've had that program in the past. But it's more often going to be because you're doing a good job of documenting and of making sure you're providing feedback. And when you see those trends and the kind of feedback you keep having to provide, you take that opportunity to provide some reactive training and make sure that we're addressing the things that we're seeing pop up in the moment. So that feedback can be really important. And like Sarah said, it really is important that it go both ways. But we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when it needs to go a little more in that negative direction. So let's talk a little bit about progressive discipline. So progressive discipline, we all know what it is. We've all got a policy for it, but it's really important. And part of the reason it's so important is because of this idea of making sure that we are correcting behavior that needs to be corrected and keeping kids safe. And here's why I say this, and we're going to talk in a little bit about an incident where this kind of thing popped up to kind of give it some context. But we've got to make sure we've got some places where things are just zero tolerance, right? A lot of those are going to be around our abuse prevention practices. We're going to have zero tolerance for being one-on-one alone with a kid, right? We're going to have zero tolerance for inappropriate touch, right? Whatever that is. We're going to have zero tolerance for, hey, we have a no tolerance policy about connecting with our kids on social media. And here we are making sure that we're all friends on Facebook, right? Facebook shows my age, by the way. Now I don't even know how to be friends on TikTok, but whatever that is, and there's probably another one I don't even know about. But we want to make sure that we've got those zero tolerance policies in writing, right? This is going to come as no surprise, and that our staff know about them, because that's going to be a place where progressive discipline happens pretty fast. But then we need to think about those other things and times where we've got rule breaking, right? And we need to have a policy in place for, okay, what do we do when that happens? And how do we make sure that we're all addressing those things? If Sarah has seen me with my phone and Hugh has seen me with my phone, and we don't have a centralized review, that means we're not going to put corrective action into place either, right? What would be appropriate is when Sarah sees me with my phone, that first time it's a write-up and she pulls me in and we have a conversation and it's, hey, if we see that again, here's what's going to happen. Or, hey, for the next 10 days, here's our expectations and let's make sure you're meeting them. But we need to make sure that we're all talking to each other about what that review process looks like to make sure that any rule breaking can be addressed, and then not just addressed by me, but addressed by all of us as a leadership team, because I'm not going to be there every day, or I might not see the next incident. And so when we think about centralized review, that also helps us make sure that any corrections we make are consistent across employees and are objective, which means we've laid them out in advance and we're not just reacting to what we think about that person in that moment, and that that's fair across all of our employees, right? Because that's just, again, an EPLI claim or a DNO claim waiting to happen if different staff members feel like they're being treated differently. So if we've got a plan for how we're going to do progressive discipline, we review it in a centralized way and manage it in a consistent way, that's setting us up for the most success. And so obviously, last bullet point, are you so surprised? That means we've got to have really great documentation. It means we've got to have great documentation up front about here's what our progressive discipline plan is. And it means we've got to have great documentation throughout when we actually have to put a progressive discipline plan in place. Now, we don't like to keep performance management all about the negative, right? But I think one of the things that Sarah brought up that's so important is this idea of catching them doing something good, making sure we're praising publicly, something we've all heard as leaders before, praise publicly, correct in private, and making sure you know how you want to do those things. And again, making sure you do them consistently for all of your staff is really going to help set you up for success.
The other thing that I'd like to tag on here, Meredith, is
please.
One of the things that when I tell you that our day is never the same, one of the things that is pretty consistent is that a lot of times our folks will call us and what they're asking for is an exception to their policy. And so sometimes they'll call and say, well, I have this person and they, according to our driving standards, they can't be a driver for us. But what do you think, Sarah? And I'll say, well, what does your policy say? And they'll tell it back to me and I'll say, okay, well, no, I don't think you should do that, right? If that's what your policy says. Or they'll say, well, this person, we addressed this problem a year ago under a different leader, but it's come up again. What do you think? And I'll say, well, what does your progressive discipline policy say? If we've already addressed this issue, if this is their second, third, sixth, seventh warning, why are we still having this many warnings, right? And so when we have these policies in writing, when we have our progressive discipline in writing, when we have how we hire, what our job descriptions say, what our expectations are, and make sure that we don't have policy drift, right? That we can focus on delivering those programs, and that again, all of these sort of safety pieces are moving in the background, and that we don't have to consistently go back and try to move away from the well-intended and well-written policy that it was in the first place.
Absolutely. Sarah, I think that's a really great point, and it's really a great lead in to what we want to talk about next, which is, okay, so why does HR matter so much when an incident happens, right? Why is an insurance company here talking to us about what goes on in HR? So let's talk a little bit about that. We're going to walk through kind of 3 scenarios, and I call them scenarios because we've made sure to anonymize them, but these are claims and incidents that we've had reported into us. And these are just one of a few. We picked a few good examples that we think help show kind of the critical importance of making sure we've got really good HR practices baked into risk management, but we know that you can probably think of 4 more as you're hearing these. So we'll just walk through a couple. So, and the first one we want to talk about, what we had was an incident where one of our club members got injured playing basketball during after school programming. This was happening in a gymnasium, and they alleged when this claim came through that a major factor was insufficient supervision and not taking good enough care of the area where basketball was happening. What happened was this child got pushed by another member. So there was some rule breaking happening within the context of the game. But then to make it worse, when he fell out of bounds, he tripped on some other sports equipment that had been left laying on the side of the basketball court. He ends up hitting his head against a wall, and we end up with a pretty serious concussion. So all of that sounds like a perfect storm of events when it comes to making a small injury into something major. But honestly, we see this kind of stuff happen all the time. Now, none of that necessarily sounds like HR, except here was a major factor in the investigation. They had a position that was essentially a full-time sports director, and that person was the designated monitor in the gym when after-school programming was taking place. But due to budget cuts, when that person left the organization, they decided just to rehire and make the role part-time, and there was no longer an individual really dedicated to gym supervision. Instead, that was just left up to the responsibilities of club staff and group leaders, and then walk-through support from the part-time director. So what we ran into is a scenario where we had an opportunity where a lawyer said to our organization, well, you used to have a full-time person because you obviously thought it was important enough to have someone managing those responsibilities. Why would you take that position down to part-time? And of course, the response was, it was a budgetary decision, right? So when we think about positions, what are our needs? It's really important that we're thinking not just about budget, but also about safety. This goes back to something Sarah was saying earlier. When we're thinking about programming, what can we run safely? What can we do well and make sure we've got ratios where we want them? How do we make sure that we're keeping our members safe? And will I feel confident that I'm able to have that consistent supervision? So the major takeaway from this one is, if you can't afford the position, you may not be able to afford to run the program. And that's sometimes a really hard lesson for us to think about, particularly if it's something that our club has always done, or if it's a field trip we've always taken. But unfortunately, we know that what's going to happen in a potential claim scenario is we're going to run into a situation where, hey, we knew that this was really best practice, and this was the way that this should be done. We changed it. But we changed it for a reason that wasn't about making it safer or to make sure we could still stay at that level where we were comfortable. And so unfortunately, that's one of those scenarios where an incident in the gym that sounds like no big deal suddenly becomes a spot where HR and risk management are really one and the same. So like I said, we've got a whole bunch of those, but let's talk about a couple more. Sarah, you want to talk about the next one?
Yeah. So this one comes directly from an organization that has an aquatics exposure. So I know that not everybody on the screen has a pool in your organizations, but we still do serve a lot of clubs that have pools. And I bet you can all think about a time when you have taken your kiddos on a field trip to a pool. So this is actually, unfortunately, a major aquatic incident and was a fatality. So it involved a non-swimmer, a child who ended up in the water, underwater in the deep end, for over 5 minutes. And so as the investigation happened, one of the things that we learned was the lifeguard, pretty young, 16 years old, was on duty alone, which is not something that we recommend. We always recommend 2 lifeguards. And we couldn't verify the training that she had received. So again, similar to one of the examples I used for you before, the aquatics leadership could tell you she was in this training, that she had completed all of her certifications from the summer before, that she had been in service trainings there, what topics they covered, but none of it was documented. And so that was one of the key sort of parts of the investigation, that it was negligent training on behalf of this organization, and that had this person been trained better, or by their terms better, but had this person been trained and we could show that it had been documented, that maybe this fatality wouldn't have happened. So if anybody's keeping score, yes, we want you to document or it didn't happen.
Sarah,
And
just
then,
for clarity, should we be documenting things?
I'm thinking we should document.
Got it. Okay.
If you take nothing away from this, please start documenting. Or if you already do document a lot, document some more.
Oh,
And the last claim scenario,
I've gotten into your head. I can't help it. I'm so sorry.
the last claim scenario that we're going to talk about is unfortunately abuse incident that happened on a playground. And this involved a staff member that had repeated rule violations. And in the grand scheme of things, they were small, right? This was somebody who was late to work. They had a no-show. They were sleeping at work. They were cell phone at work. Any one of those, you're all thinking about like, oh, I had to talk to a staff member about that last week, or yep, I'm thinking about that person. This person in particular had over 12 write-ups in a pretty short amount of time with his employment with this organization. And they kept him on staff to keep him in ratio because the demand called for it. What was interesting about this investigation is that when we went back, we found all of the write-ups were held at the site that he worked at, and they didn't flow all the way up to the administration where they should have. And so they never went to the main office. And because there were so many different people that had eyes on this program, no one person was responsible for all the write-ups. And it doesn't have to be that way. We have lots of different levels of leadership that can provide coaching and praise and correction for our staff. But one of the things that we do want, when I mentioned those trends earlier, is we should have been able to catch that this person was rule breaking, right? He wasn't abusing, up until the point that we know of, he wasn't abusing children in front of us, but he was allowed to break a lot of these rules. And it's somebody who shouldn't have been at our organization any longer than he had been. And so the key lesson here is that we don't catch abusers abusing, we catch them breaking the rules. And a lot of times people will start to push those little boundaries. They're not going to show up in uniform. They're going to tell a joke that maybe isn't appropriate, and they're going to see who and what they can get away with. And even though this was documented, people were not connecting the dots on, we have a person who shouldn't be in our programming, much less around children.
I think that's such a great point, Sarah. And it goes back to some of the other themes we're thinking, right? With centralized review and making sure that we're not just documenting what happens, we're keeping track of those trends, of problem concerns, we're addressing them individually. We're also doing some reactive training if we need to, if there are larger groups or if this is something we're seeing across the board. So I know we're getting close to time and we want to make sure we leave a few minutes left here at the end for some questions. So what I would say too is as we wrap up here, please feel free to start putting some questions in the chat and we'll hopefully get to those as we can. But we wanted to just share sort of what we've seen as far as, you know, some just easy things. I say easy, right? Some easy ideas to think about how you can implement them within your organization that we've really seen when we see organizations that are taking HR to the next level and that are really using their HR practices as a really valuable key to their risk management process as a whole. And so one of those is that safety starts at the top, right? Safety's got to start from the top down. And one of the things that I think is awesome is all of you on the screen with us today are a great example of what that can look like, which is that we've got to have our CEOs, we've got to have our board chairs and our safety committees really invested in what it means for us to have a culture of safety. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about what that can look like, how we can start to make that a norm?
Yeah, and so what this really looks like is leadership presence in your clubs. So for a lot of our organizations that we work with, we're doing virtual visits because we cannot be on site just yet. And so I've had board members attend those virtual visits. So they are walking through my facilities in the same time that I am walking through. How often outside of the one time a year where the safety committee comes to look at the facilities, how often do you have leadership eyes on your facilities? I know we are still in the thick of staff shortages, but do you have an ability to have other staff shadow and learn what's going on in other programs? Is there somebody who's running their sports program perfectly at one unit and you want your other unit directors to get eyes on that program? It includes incident debriefings, right? Some of our organizations call these near misses. We don't use those words, but there's always ways that you can learn from what happened. If you had a really good success of this, there was a fight that broke out in the club. How did we de-escalate? How did we have a good conversation with the parents where they didn't immediately run to go post everything on social media? How did that work out? How did you accomplish that? And then it's also regular meetings between your core leadership and your HR professionals. And so for some of our organizations, your HR is your CFO, is your CEO, is your COO. I know there's a lot of times that a lot of our folks wear many different hats. But are you really sitting down to say, this is what we're facing beyond a staff shortage? Are you thinking about where could we be in a year? What are the steps we need to do to get there, to get to hire what we need to do? What is the fundraising that needs to happen to get us to where we want to be in a year?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sarah. It really does all hang together. You know, you can't think about development without also thinking about safety. You can't think about risk management without also thinking about HR. And like the way these different things all hang together, I think is really important to make sure that leadership presence that really has that top level view that's doing that strategic thinking and planning is really dug in on this topic as well. And so this one will probably come as no surprise, but clear expectations and consistent accountability. And again, this is going to go back to everything from your hiring process, all the way through your onboarding process, all the way through your ongoing training, and really all the work that you're doing throughout your time serving your club. So when we think about clear expectations, that's about making sure that we are consistently setting up, here's what we need from you. Here's what we're about as an organization. And if that's not what we're doing, we're going to make sure we find a way to pull ourselves back to what we know to be the right thing to do. And so some of that's going to be from having a really great job description where you lay it out from the get-go and you start to set up those questions in your interview. Hey, how would you handle this kind of situation that we know our club staff face every day? It's about making sure that when we are thinking about accountability, it's not just from the top down. It's also thinking about how staff are holding each other accountable. One of the things that tends to pop up in this idea of, well, we don't catch abusers abusing, we catch them breaking rules, is we sometimes hear that there's a fear, right, of a staff member saying, well, I don't want to get someone in trouble for breaking a rule. We're not saying that everyone who breaks a rule is a potential abuser. What we're saying is when we look backwards in an abuse allegation or an abuse investigation, we see that pattern of rule breaking. So let's just make sure we stop it in its tracks and don't ever even need to get there. And so making sure that our staff know it is our responsibility to work together. That's the place where we know we've got to have accountability across our staff and then up and down with our leadership. And again, that consistency piece is really important. Making sure you're treating all of your staff the same, that everyone is held to the same standard, that we're maintaining that documentation, and that every time we hire someone for a role, we're holding them to that same set of standards. It's critically important. And I know we've got some questions in the chat, so I want to switch over and make sure we can answer some of those. It wouldn't be right for us to not also make sure we have an opportunity to thank all of you for being here with us. So we'll do that too. Sarah, did you want to add something before we jump into questions?
Nope, but we had an early on question. And so I promised her we would hit it at the end. And I think it was a really good one. And so the question was around how do we involve or use or maybe not use social media as a part of our screening procedures, which is a great question. And so the first question that I would ask is, what information do you think you will glean from social media? And so one of the really important factors that we know about how we hire and how to not be biased in hiring is to make sure we wouldn't find knowable information. And a lot of times on social media, we find information that we wouldn't know as a part, that we shouldn't know as a part of an interview process, right? So you might know, or you might find out from social media that this person has children, and that's not a question we would ever ask. You might find out from social media what this person's religion is, and that's not a question we should ever ask. You might find out from social media whether this person has reliable transportation or not. And to say that this might not cloud your judgment is a hard line to draw in the sand. And so we know that social media is available to you. I know that when I have hired in the past, one of the things that I will do is Google that person's name. But we also know that using social media can oftentimes give you information that you shouldn't know as a part of the hiring process.
That's a really great distinction, Sarah. We also had a question about, do we have any kind of template or suggestions about what onboarding should look like, right? What mandatory trainings there should be for a new YDP? Thoughts on that?
Yeah. So some of the basic things that beyond, you're going to get sort of standard stuff from bgca.net. And standard stuff that we recommend in the beginning are absolutely child abuse prevention. Before they should ever interact with youth at all, we want them to have that training. Other sort of HR tick the boxes, bloodborne pathogens, sexual harassment prevention, those types of things. And then think about what they really need in their job, right? So we just on our learning management system, we have things about discipline, we have things about playground management, those types of things. So really think about what your space needs and what your programs need, and then train back to that, right? And so do we have a template? We don't, right? Because our organizations are all very different. Some of our boys and girls clubs have swim teams. Some of our boys and girls clubs are in a storefront. And so maybe what some of those YDPs need are different across the board. But one of the I think it's a really good question. So maybe that's a resource that we need to make.
Yeah, agreed. We also got a question about, so what policies should you use volunteers? We use the same process as our staff. If you're using the same process as your staff, you are spot on. That is always going to be our best practice recommendation. If this is someone that you are trusting to be around your club members and in your space, they should be held to the same standard as your staff. Now, when I say held to the same standard, right, their responsibilities are going to be wildly different. It is our hope that volunteers aren't who you're using in ratio, right? That should be your staff members who are legally responsible for making sure that we're keeping our members safe. But when you think about your screening processes, what they're required to sign off on as far as a code of conduct or your abuse prevention policies, understanding your reporting structures, understanding your zero tolerance policies, those are all places where we want to be holding your staff and your volunteers to the same standard because they've got the same access to the kids in your care and to your space. So if you're using the same process as your staff, 2 thumbs up. Very excited about that. I'm scrolling.
And you've already done the work to write the policies, and you've done the
go.
work to build a training and all of those things. So yeah, as much as it can mirror your staff, we highly recommend.
Absolutely. I want to say too, I see this last question about, is anyone using interns in their ratio? I'm not going to lie to you and say that we don't see it. I can tell you we don't want to see it. That is not someone who has probably been screened or trained to the same extent that your staff has. We also want to think about ages, right? Particularly when we think about the youth in our care, we want to make sure that the very minimum, we've got somebody 18 plus who is responsible for the minors in your care, but we always want your ratios to be staff. We think it's very appropriate. You might have a junior staff program, you might have volunteers in your spaces. We want to make sure they're an extra set of eyes and they know what their responsibilities are. But for ratio purposes, it's always going to be our best practice recommendation that you're using staff.
And AmeriCorps staff can be staff. I know that's a question that sometimes we'll get. AmeriCorps staff can be staff.
Great question. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Lori, I see you coming off. I think that means we should stop talking.
Yeah. Meredith and Sarah, thank you so very much. I took a lot of great notes. I love some of the things you said. What really resonated with me is we don't catch abusers abusing, we catch them breaking rules. And I think that's really important that we have that consistency and that documentation. All of those things that you said is, I think, so helpful. So thank you for joining us and giving us your expertise today. I know we've gotten a lot of comments about they want these slides, they want these things. So yes, after the session, they've already been uploaded. The PDF of the slides will be available in your portal, and by the end of the day, the recording will also be available. Thank you so much, everyone. for your, Meredith and Sarah, thank you for your time and talent. Everyone else, thank you for your time today. If you'd like to go to another session, you can go back to the homepage in the See Event Attendee Hub and click all sections, and you can join from there. Thanks again, everybody, for your time and participation. Have a blessed day.